Welcome everyone to our final event for Research Week this week. As you would know, our focus is on working beyond academia, and we've had some really good sessions on this so far, and I'm sure this session is going to be really good too. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor Jo Devlin. I'm currently Associate Dean Research. For those of you who don't know me, I don't normally have a black eye. I have a black eye today. I'm sorry for that. I didn't get in a fight or anything. I got kicked by a horse. It's actually that nasty little horse behind me. So I apologise that I look a bit odd today. Fortunately, though, you won't be looking at me. You'll be looking at our guest speakers. So we have two guest speakers in this session, and they'll be talking about pitching to industry partners. And so we're going to hear a little bit of advice from them, and also a bit about what type of resources are available for you in pitching your ideas to industry partners. So today we have, as I said, two presenters. We have Professor Davi Ferla, who will be speaking first, and then we also have Associate Professor Greg Harper, who will be following on. So with that, I'd like to hand over to our first presenter, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing what he has to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Jo, and the rest of the team for inviting me to participate in Research Week 2020. I'm happy to be here as a scientist and hope that over the next 15 minutes or so, I'm able to do justice to the program and make a contribution to the growth and development of our researchers in the agricultural and veterinary sciences. Before we start, I'd like you to know that whilst I've reviewed the technical literature, I've built this presentation primarily based on the 20+ years of experience I've had actually working in industry while playing board, executive and business development roles. I've reflected on a long list of negotiations where I've represented or otherwise engaged with corporations, small and medium enterprises, academic institutions, research institutions and government. And perhaps most importantly, I've injected into this presentation the key lessons I've learned and am still learning in leading diverse bid teams vying for major projects and pursuing a long tail of smaller projects. In terms of today's agenda, we'll be looking at what we've learned so far, what we'll learn here, why industry engagement is so important, why pitching is such a bad place to start, whether there is a better way, and some key takeaways. Of course, we'll be happy to answer your questions at the end of the session, so please do feel free to make use of the Q&A function during the presentation. Next slide, please. So far, we've learned quite a bit. Yesterday morning, we looked at who needs your research. In the afternoon, we explored how you should approach industry engagement. And this morning, we considered how external partnerships could shape your research career and your opportunities. Next slide, please. This afternoon, we'll present a grounded view on where you could start in relation to engaging industry partners and who within our institution could help you with your engagement efforts. So let's get into it. Industry engagement is so important for several reasons. Firstly, academia and industry are complementary and are well placed to co-create the future. Whenever I've experienced conflicts or inconsistencies between parties, it's been a result of bad behaviour by individuals or teams on either or both sides of the ledger and not academia versus industry per se. Industry participants can positively shape research programs and research questions in terms of impact. And frankly, I struggle to follow any discussion around impact when those discussions don't actually involve industry participants. And finally, industry can provide financial and non-financial resources that underpin research activities. Indeed, I'm firmly of the view that industry eagerly wants to provide these resources when it can see benefits associated with the research in relation to capitalising on upside opportunities and mitigating downside risk. At this point, it's non-trivial in the context of our current operating environment, and the requirements of grant programs. It's also germane in relation to our recently published Advancing Melbourne 2030 strategic plan. Next slide, please. When it comes to industry engagement, I reckon pitching is such a bad place to start. There are lots of reasons for this, and here are a handful. Firstly, it demonstrates a lack of respect. And by this, I mean a lack of respect for your audience, for your colleagues, and for yourself. Secondly, pitching too soon does not create rapport and engender trust. And in fact, by doing this, you'll do a really good job of disenfranchising people and invoking disinterest and mistrust. At a fundamental level, when you pitch too soon, you have insufficient information upon which to base an impressive and engaging pitch. And as a result, you're likely to be off target. And of greatest concern to me, you will almost certainly raise objections, or in other words, create serious obstacles you'll need to overcome later. And finally, you'll be forced to adopt a research push stance rather than the far more effective and efficient market pull stance. Next slide, please. So yes, there is a much better way. Let's look at the 4 stages first, and you'll notice that there's a start, a middle, and an end. And you'll also notice that pitching comes toward the end and not the start. Firstly, there's the opening stage. This is where you make initial contact or a series of early contacts and gain the industry participants' agreement to ask questions. This is where you establish an industry-centered purpose and communicate who you are and why you're there. Then there's the researching stage. This is where your sole aim is to discover, explore, clarify, and understand the industry participants' needs and problems, not yours. This, in my view, is the most crucial stage. Next is the pitching stage. This is now where you collate and analyse the information you've acquired and sell to the industry participant the benefits of your research and not its features and advantages. Please note that benefits show how your research program meets a need explicitly expressed by the industry participant. And finally comes the closing stage. This is where you simply focus on obtaining commitment. Given that the most crucial stage is the researching stage, the most important thing you can do is ask great questions. So let's now look at the 4 types of questions you could ask. Firstly, there are context questions. These are questions that allow you to seek facts and uncover the context in which you and the industry participant are operating in. I strongly advise you to do your own research and keep these questions to a bare minimum. An example of a context question is, so, what is your role at Dairy Australia? Then there are problems questions. Here, you're trying to uncover the difficulties the industry representative is experiencing. Naturally, you should aim to uncover problems you could ultimately solve through your research and gain a shared understanding of these problems. I recommend that you again do your research and keep these questions to a minimum. An example of a problems question is, are you satisfied with your current process for hyperspectral imaging and the results it provides you? I suggest that this is a good question to ask if your research has already uncovered and hinted at the answer. Next come implications questions. These questions enable you to highlight the effects of the problems and develop the seriousness of those problems to increase the industry participants' motivation to change. In simple terms, they develop implied needs into explicit needs. An example of this type of question is, would your customers be more loyal if you could provide more accurate assessments of the soil microbiome? I'll make a special note here. Please resist the temptation to offer solutions too soon. And finally, we have value questions. Here, you're attempting to ground the usefulness of your research-oriented solution by giving the industry participant opportunities to express their explicit needs and the benefits your solution offers. In this way, they will be experiencing some critical ownership. An example of a value question is, if you could cut your food safety testing costs by 80%, would this enable you to attain your budgeted revenues and profits? I'd like to make another special note before moving on. It may be worthwhile for you to reflect at this time on a concept that is cited across industry, most commonly in the technology startup or scale-up markets I work in. This is the concept of product market fit. If we revise the common definitions of this concept to suit the current topic in the context of Research Week 2020, we arrive at simply operating in an attractive industry with a research offering that can satisfy that industry. So, for this part of the presentation, I invite you to reflect on the following. When a bad research team meets a great market, the market wins. When a great research team meets a bad market, the market wins. When a great research team meets a great market, something special happens. Next slide, please. It's worth noting that there are essentially 4 outcomes to consider. One is partnership. This is where the industry participant agrees to partner with you and purchase your research and shows their strong desire by executing the contract. Another outcome is advance. This refers to an action the industry participant commits to that moves you closer to that purpose. Yet another is continuation. This is where you don't reach an agreement on an action that moves the sale forward. And finally, there's no partnership. As the name suggests, the industry participant rejects your research offer. I'll make one final special note here. While partnership is clearly the best outcome and advance is obviously a desirable outcome, no partnership is not the worst outcome. Continuation is, because you're much better off with a quick no than a long maybe. It's also worth noting that you're likely to encounter objections along the way. Please don't be discouraged by them. They're a real-world part of the industry engagement process and contributors to your growth and development. I'd like to point out that there are value objections and capability objections. Value objections are those where the industry participant isn't convinced about your product's return on investment, that is, their return on investment. And capability objections are those where the industry participant doubts your research program can meet their specific needs. In this case, they think you and your solution can't solve one of their main priorities. Please note that while your objective in the first case is to strengthen your business proposition, the objective in the second case is to build your team's capabilities or the industry's perception of those capabilities. Next slide, please. So, here is a bundle of key takeaways. You are a researcher and have a gift for inquisitiveness. It's one of the things that got you to where you are today, and it's one of the things that will take you to the places you'll get to. So, use it with your engagement with industry participants. You must have a problem-solving orientation that is biased towards industry strategic and operational problems and not your funding problems. Don't worry, if you get this gig right, the cash will flow and potentially lots of it. Relationships and not transactions underpin your growth trajectory. While a transaction may enable you to secure a win, by its very nature, it can't underpin the string of successes that a relationship does. Understand the people in front of you and those beside you. It's far more important to understand than to persuade. Be clear on whether you and your team members are dealing with an end user, a decision maker, a financier, or someone altogether different. You can harness social media networks to great effect here. Building respectful and mutually reinforcing networks among your colleagues and across industry will serve you well. Ask great questions. A very useful rule of thumb in this regard for industry engagement is to listen at least twice as much as you talk. Don't follow a rigid formula. Be flexible, and note that as the number of stakeholders grows larger and internal processes become more complex, your industry engagement capabilities gets more valuable. Guide the research buying process. Prospects need you to help them purchase your research. Build traction progressively. Top researchers reach their goals by planning and conducting engagements with industry that move formal partnerships forward in steps. And this is true whether you're taking a bottom-up approach or a top-down approach in your string of engagements. And finally, please acknowledge that all great things take time, but this does not mean that you should universally move slowly. Agility and responsiveness are critically important, particularly in the current operating environment. The big won't necessarily beat the small, but the fast will almost certainly beat the slow. And now I'll hand you over to Associate Professor Greg Harper, who is the Business Development Director within RIG. Thanks, Greg.
Hey, thanks so much, Davi. That was a great presentation, and the audience will need to know that Davi and I worked on this to some extent, and you'll be surprised at how many of the same themes will come up, but we will express them in quite different ways. Likewise, just the way Davi did, let me just introduce myself to you. Many of you won't really know me, but I guess what I bring to this conversation is my career as being a researcher, then a research leader, and then spending time in industry on secondment, then time in executive in CSIRO, time on a board in Meat and Livestock Australia, before coming as Business Development Director here into the Faculty of Vet and Agricultural Sciences. And now I lead the business development team across the STEM group of faculties. So I really am passionate about business development, translation and impact of research, and I'll be very lucky to have been involved in a number of high impact research projects through my career. So the summary of my presentation is similar in that, why pitch to potential industry partner? Who exactly are you pitching to? What might they want to hear from us? And my answer being, well, that really depends. And if you're really serious about making a pitch, and as Davi says, when the time is right, what are some of the pitfalls that I've seen and heard, and maybe even fallen into myself? And in the end, I'll end up with some challenging concepts that I hope will offend you enough to make you think and adopt some new practice. Next slide, please. So why pitch? And I've just chosen this particular photograph of myself, obviously looking a lot younger than I do now, with three great colleagues of mine. Jim Aylward, who started Peplin, an onco-biology company. Jay Hetzel, who is now the chairman of UniQuest. And Peter Riddles, who is an international consultant working on innovation systems in agricultural biotechnology and medical biotechnology as well, and was president of Oz Biotech. So in each of these cases, these three folks, who won't necessarily be that different from you, have pitched big ideas at different times in their careers and were successful. And as a result, each one of those folks has been able to contribute significant new information or value. And so I go on to say, but we pitch because impact from your work requires delivery as a new product, perhaps a new service, perhaps a change in some public policy, or indeed a published article that changes people's thinking fundamentally. To get any of those things up, you have to be prepared to pitch the idea. And ultimately, you're seeking to influence somebody, to change something for the better. You're not just sharing your knowledge, you're seeking to change the way they work. And you need to understand then what real needs are before you seek to change and to make a difference. Next slide, please. And so then, to whom are you pitching? Well, in this particular case today, we're being asked about industry. And what I'd say is that having worked in the academic environment, we don't really have a great sense of what that word industry means. And if you start digging in right across the value chain of the university, every part of what we do, industry has a whole range of meanings. And so it might mean to companies, but what sort of companies? Are we talking global corporates? Are we talking local leaders, fast followers? Are we talking startup companies? Or are we talking to the bankers of those companies? The way that you'll pitch and the types of things that you will consider will be different. The context, as Davi said, and the issues that are confronting each of those companies will be quite different. In our case, working in agriculture and veterinary science, we're often pitching to rural RDCs. And I often hear people say, you know, I've spoken about this particular body of work with industry. No, you've spoken to a rural research and development corporation. They are not industry. There's something in between. They're a unique structure that exists in Australia between industry and government. And while we love them, they have very specific goals of their own. And it depends when you're speaking to somebody in an RDC, whether you're speaking to a program manager, the CEO, or a board member. And I've been two of those, and I know that their perspectives are quite different depending on how close they are to levy-paying producers, or indeed how close they are to government, which maintains a very strong hand on our RDCs. And in a similar way, you can think about, if you're speaking to industry, users of our work, some of those are actually government departments that use our work. And so it depends hugely whether you're talking to a low-level manager or the secretary of department. And following through, NGOs can also be seen to some extent as in industry, particularly because those folks are often now running corporate social responsibility programs. So all of this is about the research, I think, that Davi mentioned. You can do a lot of this work before you even open your mouth and decide what you're going to say to the potential company. And the two photographs I tried to indicate there, very different styles of environment, one being the back streets of Old Delhi and the other being a more diplomatic environment where you're dealing with whole communities and indeed government transfers. Next slide, please. So what do you think they wish to hear from us? Well, it really depends. And so if you're talking to an organization, let's now talk about a company, right? Let's talk about a company in mid-flight, not a global corporate, but a company that's seeking aggressive growth, for example. Small company, keen to make a difference. You know, they might be in a growth phase. They may have secured their funding and they're ready to go to the next level. Or indeed, they might be fighting to survive. Or indeed, they might be feeling pretty comfortable right now. Or indeed, they might be completely unaware that they're about to hit the wall. Again, with a little bit of work, you can work out what your particular company is facing right at the minute. And it makes a huge difference in terms of whether or not your idea is going to be snapped up in a second, or your idea is just going to be ignored and you're completely wasting your time. And then, is the person you're speaking to, are they seeking your ideas to improve their own individual position? Is it possible that by adopting and funding your idea, they're going to accelerate their own career? Or on the other hand, if by adopting your particular idea, they're consigning their favorites, or even worse, their boss's favorite product to the graveyard. Again, a little bit of work and you can work out how your idea is going to be considered and approached by the person you're pitching to. So how do you find this stuff out, you know, and is it relevant? Next slide, please. Well, that is one of the roles of RIC, the group that I work in inside RIC, being Research, Innovation and Commercialisation. It's part of the Chief Operating Officer's portfolio here in the University of Melbourne. And the particular group I work in is business development and innovation. Now, my own particular arrangement, just to quickly describe that. So I'm employed by business development and innovation inside RIC, but my primary home is vet and agricultural sciences. So it is a matrix that I work within, and it means that inside the business development and innovation team, I'm working with people who have similar skills and similar backgrounds, and we can benchmark against one another, even though we're focusing our energy in different sectors of the economy. And my colleague Rob Mann, and you may recall Martin Elhay, were under very similar arrangements. So the purpose of this business development innovation team is to facilitate translation. I won't read these slides for you, you can work it out yourself. But it's to bring our skills to facilitate that translation, and indeed to increase the chance and the efficiency by which we get our knowledge out into the community to create impacts. That's truly what innovation is, when the impact is felt by the community. And our approach is firstly, working closely with the researchers themselves, because it's you researchers that ultimately have the entrepreneurship. It's you that are saying, I think I can induce change through something I know. That's research entrepreneurship. It's different from starting a company or challenging some existing policy inside a big company. This is a research entrepreneurship, and you look in the internet, you'll find that there's definitions of that exact skill set. We're multidisciplinary. We work constantly in this environment of one faculty collaborating with another. We try to express and encourage the expression of integrity. Nobody gets value in this environment from us tricking potential partners or hiding potential conflicts of interest. Nobody gets value out of this. The best thing for us to do is identify when people don't know what they don't know. We're growth-minded. We're all here because we want to see innovation occur. We're not here for the status quo. Most of us would move on and do something else rather than just sit and say, well, we're maintaining status quo. We try to be as agile as possible, which means that circumstances are constantly changing. And in my particular circumstance, you know, I'm encouraged to manage 20 or 50 opportunities at once rather than drill in to one opportunity at a time. So it's quite a different approach to my work compared to where I was back as a research scientist. And finally, teamwork is critical to it. You would have heard Davi say that when it comes time to pitch, you look at who's in front of you, meaning on the opposite side of the table, but you also look at who's beside you. And one of the key learnings for me is that whenever I've done these major pitches, I'm actively choosing who's beside me. Do I have a finance person? Do I have an IP specialist? Do I have a specialist negotiator? Do I have, you know, who else is with me? It's not just about a group of people with exactly the same skills. Next slide, please. Again, a little bit more detail here that you can pick up later. This then is a definition of exactly what we're trying to do, what sorts of things we do, and what sorts of skills do we bring to the table. Next slide, please. But I've just underlined the fact that, you know, connecting our university with industry, government, and investment partners, that's a big part of what we do. And the type of approach we take, the types of skills we bring are business development, industry knowledge, intellectual property, licensing experience, those sorts of things, commercial interaction. Next slide, please. So some pitfalls. And like I admitted before, I reckon I'm guilty of any number of these. But for what it's worth, certainly you will fail if you've not done that research that Davi talked about. That's about pre-reading, communicating, pre-reading things like websites, annual reports, if it's a big global company, industry press, those sorts of things. Communicating purpose. Before you go to any meeting, you should be able to explain to people what exactly it is that meeting is about. Why are you there? Planning the meeting. Who else is at the meeting? Who's going to do what? When will you finish? Controlling time and content. Reiterating another point there, an awful pitfall, unfortunately, is the one of talking until somebody, somewhat embarrassed, has to stop you from talking, and not listening. You are really there in those meetings to listen to not just what the company wants or the individuals want, but the lived experience. What does it mean that those people don't have the solution that you think you have? What exactly does it mean to them? You're insulting a counterparty, really, by refusing to steadfastly see the situation from their perspective. If they're a company, big or small, they have a legitimate reason, and the people you'll be talking with are often proud of those organizations, and they want you to help them become better. And if you're just pushing your tech onto them, that's a little bit of an insult, I must admit. The other risk, when I reflect now on other groups that I've been in and contributed to across Australia, we run the risk of sometimes thinking too small. We think about our own lab or our own team, or even our own university. And the biggest goals that we should be chasing right now are what we can contribute to the global community, the biggest possible goals. And you'll see a lot of that coming up in the Advancing Melbourne 2030 strategy, which is about our convening power. So yes, we can look after our own lab and our own teams, but sometimes there's more that can be done, yeah? Also, in negotiating contract terms, so prior to an organised, well-constructed meeting, there's always the risk that some well-meaning person has actually negotiated the contract before we even get there. That somebody has sort of said, of course, the university will accept such and such a deal. It's just a matter of my telling those damn administrators to finalise the deal the way I want it to be. I'm sorry, I am being offensive. And really, who cares about charging overheads anyway? You know, it's just the administrators after all. These are awful things, because what happens is when we then get to a major deal, we then have to pull apart those earlier understandings and commitments, and then put in place those that the university will actually accept. And I've been in the room a number of times when I've heard people say, I don't care about intellectual property. I just need money for my research. And by the way, there's no background IP. These things are not the sorts of things that researchers alone should be saying. The companies will hear them, particularly global companies will hear people make those comments and think, boy, that's not very sophisticated. If we're working in an organisation like University of Melbourne seriously, we can couch things with much greater insight than that. Next slide, please. I did warn you I'd try to be offensive to bring things along. But even more insulting to some extent is, you know what? What Davi and I have been talking about, these are sales techniques. And I know through my career, anytime I've said the word sales, people have sort of gone, oh no, we don't want to be salespeople. I think, you know, anybody that knows the Arthur Miller play Death of a Salesman, that's our view of what sales is. But the reality of the circumstance is we are bringing ideas forward that will induce changes in people's companies or what they do or their products or policies that influence the community. You have to sell those ideas. You have to give people reasons for wanting to adopt and change where they are. And the particular framework I'm most used to is one put forward by a group called Miller Heiman, and it involves strategic selling, conceptual selling, and large account management. And I have just repitched some of those ideas to you from that framework. I think it's really important that you keep in mind that these frameworks, you don't need to become a salesman to be a good researcher. but it's sometimes good to draw on the knowledge and the frameworks to reach your particular objectives, because the community gets value out of doing it. So, you know, being adaptable and accepting that some of these methodologies are helpful will ultimately help all of us. And, you know, I've certainly heard the next one, which is, you know, learning about things like sales techniques, that's just a waste of time. Well, I don't agree, and I hope I've been able to convince you. And particularly to the ECRs, you know, your careers are really not going to be much like the careers that people like myself or the senior members of staff have experienced. The world, I think, is really changing, and you just need to look at the wording of the Advancing Melbourne 2030 strategy, many other public documents that are talking about the importance of impact, the importance of translation, how Australia is not particularly good at doing this translation. All of that says to me that we're in a bit of a time of change, and that's not taking into account the influence of COVID-19, which has seen this university, I need to say, absolutely pivot on a dime to move much of its work away from discovery through to translation. And in response to government initiatives, it's very quickly brought together. A whole lot of projects can be translated and brought to commercial market, hopefully to produce community health impacts. Next slide, I think that might be done. I'm done. Thank you so much, and I hope I haven't been too offensive.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Davi. Could we have Davi back on screen and unmuted? Great. Thanks to you both for the presentation. I think I'll pick up on one of the last points that you made there. We always hear of American universities being quite in tune with industry or securing large dollars in these sort of co-located tech parks. But Australia hasn't really engaged or got that same level going. What's missing? Where do we need to go?
So, Rich, if I can continue to hold the license to sort of interpret, I have been surprised. Here we are in a university that spends $1 billion a year of public and private money in doing research and development. Now, that happens to be, in terms of investments, about the same scale as MIT. Yet the amount of intellectual property that we generate out of the University of Melbourne is not 10% less, it's 10-fold less.
Wow.
So there's a huge difference in the entire environment that we're operating in. And I think that this is about, yes, it's about how we encourage young researchers. It's about what the community understands from research and development. It's about the investor community. It's a whole innovation system problem, but we need to be careful not to be too comfortable with our own rhetoric. We do really well at discovery. I'm not going to discount that at all. Brilliantly at discovery, but we truly don't get it right when it comes to translating.
Davi, any comment you wanted to add?
I agree with Greg on that, and it is a structural issue that we face here. But I will say that those numbers do mask some pockets of brilliance that we do have from time to time. But Greg is right on the money. It is a systemic issue, and you're quite right to point out, Rich, the way in which we compare and contrast globally, and what we should be prioritising here, and how we encourage our researchers, particularly early mid-career researchers, to respond to those realities.
I'll give you an example. I was just aware recently of the total research dollars that Bayer spend in the United States through universities versus the total research dollars Bayer spends in Australia. And it was, I think, 2 zeros difference. How do we change that?
So one of the things I saw, because I worked in Sweden for a while, one of the things I saw there was much more use of the innovation system model. So there in Uppsala, you could be working in the medical university in the morning, working in the veterinary university in the afternoon, and on the weekend working in Pharmacia, which was a big biotech company in the city at that time. And you were allowed to freely move around. Now, obviously, there's cultural aspects there, and we have to manage the commercial realities of that. But this preparedness to be much more flexible in your career is a key part. And you see it also in Germany. People, in fact, senior professors in some universities can only get there if they've had significant periods of time in industry.
Interesting.
And Rich, you make reference to Bayer specifically. And Bayer has a stance globally that it will look at very early stage technologies and research in terms of grounding it and testing it in places like Australia, but the big dollars are going to flow elsewhere. And the other note that I make on this is that we collectively have contributed to those perceptions of the way that things work in Australia. And I know from my experience, when I've had those discussions and I've challenged people about the capabilities here in Australia and the contributions that specific streams could make to a global market, it's challenged people to think beyond the familiar. So I think that it's not a case that those perceptions have been formed in a vacuum. I think that the activities of certain organisations, public-private, in Australia have informed that kind of decision. And I think the game is changing, but it will take time.
Mm-hmm. Alistair's asked a question about, should our ECRs get some formal training in marketing to aid with both grant writing and industry engagement? Do you think that's useful?
You go, Davi.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think it will contribute to the way that our researchers frame their journey and frame their offering. And it shouldn't be seen as separate to or counter to or in conflict with, provided it is presented as a constituent of success, where you couple it with your fundamental science training. It could unlock so much value for those researchers and the teams that they're part of. I think more of that will make such a difference. It's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, it is a really good question. I think it's important to see that all these bodies of knowledge are there available for you. Just saying exactly what Davi said. It's not as though there's some ethical barrier that you need to go through, that it's somehow dirty or inappropriate to work in the commercial world. You can define that. These are bodies of knowledge that you can access, and if it helps you get the the final outcome of success that you're looking for, then it's worth doing. And that's not the Machiavelli form of this. That is, there are many parts to delivering these complex technological packages. The one I reflect on most there is I once had an opportunity to sit beside one of the people that started the whole medical research imaging field, the commercialization field. When I was a young fella, NMR was purely a laboratory technique. Nobody had thought that this would be something that could be used for medical imaging. So a guy from Switzerland was part of the solution to bring that through to market. Now, he was quite reasonably making money out of the companies that were created, churning that back into the next research venture. He had a social enterprise on the side, as well as probably a philanthropic activity. These things are all possible and live quite comfortably together without you necessarily feeling as though you've sold out to the dark side.
Mm. And Rich, it just occurs to me that that is a great question, but it's a question that I don't think would easily or readily be asked in those markets we referred to previously, those offshore markets, because culturally it's seen as not just acceptable, but hugely advantageous to have that scientific and commercial background or frame of reference. I have an honours degree in science, I have an MBA. Those two things are mutually reinforcing and allows me to have the kinds of conversations I can have at a technical and commercial level.
I guess Alistair's question raises the point within our faculty, because we have you two there. Where's the boundary between how far the researcher goes to develop an opportunity, or at what stage do they approach you? We've got a potential idea. Where's our first port of call? When do you hand over back to the researcher to say, well, we've done the initial relationship, you carry on? Don't know if you've got any examples you could give of that process of, you know, taking what Alice is talking about, how do you engage? Well, you know.
So I might have a bit of a go there because it's a bit of a structural response. I actually think that it's very healthy for researchers at all stages of the discovery and delivery cycle to be talking with others about what the ideas mean. It can be, you know, you're very early in the discovery process, you have a 2-minute conversation with an intellectual property attorney. And say, you know, do I think I'm in a really new area? Look, I think you are, go forward. Whereas you're in the middle, you're starting to think about commercialization, then you're always in a group with commercialization specialists, people are talking about partnerships. I think it's something that you just continue having all the time now, particularly because there is such a difference between the intellectual property literature and the scientific literature. They are interacting, but they're two different things. And so you can be taking quite different approaches.
Which the answer really is, for me, it depends. It really depends on the case. And I think along the spectrum, from the scientific to the commercial, provided there's some appreciation that you're sitting in along that spectrum, much better outcomes emerge. In a recent example, I'd made some very pointed comments in a forum, and I was approached by a major agricultural company about its interests here in Australia, and particularly in Victoria, and investments that it was making. And I could see the sense of raising into the conversation the capabilities across FVAS, because they were relevant. It wasn't a case that the conversation was leading in a different direction. It was quite obvious to me that there would be some connect. Now, those discussions have led to introducing particular expertise from within FVAS, particularly within SAF. And it was a simple case to introduce researchers, one at a very senior level and one at a mid-level, into the conversation to frame the start of a proposition. My role here is really to facilitate the discussion and not for me to delve too deeply into the science, but enable those scientists to present the case in the context of what was explicitly stated by that organisation. My interest in this particular case is not just that organisation, but to ensure that the faculty in the school could serve their interests as I've understood them and as we've understood them, because they're on a very, very strong trajectory to invest significantly and take other organisations with them. So for me, it's about presenting to my colleagues within SAF and FVAS those real opportunities that they could shine based on their pillars of strength, their science. And I think that that's a good example of playing to each strengths. You know, you've got a team there that are the members of which are doing things that they are good at and they like doing. I would say to you that if I delved too deeply into the science, it wouldn't serve anybody's interests. And if those scientists get too involved in commercial negotiations, again, it wouldn't be in their interests to do that. But the appreciation of what's happening across the team makes the most sense. And it's obvious to all the parties, both within and beyond the university, because it's focused on what the industry is basically telling us.
You might have, Greg, you might have heard of the lift test that we joke about. You know, maybe a lead on from Alistair's question is, you know, do researchers need a bit of training in the lift test? And you might want to elaborate on that.
The lift test being you're able to do an elevator pitch of your ideas. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. The old idea was, you know, you press the 13th floor button, and when you get there, someone needs to know why they should give you money. And you kind of, most researchers have 5 goes at it before they work out what the real proposition is.
Absolutely, Richard. I think it's something that's critically important, and getting the level right, you know, so that you're quickly thinking, oh, this person seems to be a CEO, I need to pitch it at this level, or this person is, you know, just an average voter who just wants to know that public money is being used well. I mean, I think that there's multiple levels. I think that the, you know, these recent activities like is it 3-minute thesis competition? I think that's it. I mean, I think that's just marvelous, just as an opportunity to drive people into thinking what's critical about this idea, and then learning how to present it in a really compelling way. Just wonderful opportunity. And I think, you know, learning these sorts of skills, it's not as though, and now I'm speaking to those people who are in the 2nd year of their PhD or in the 3rd year of the PhD and are thinking, when is this study going to end? I think the picking up some of these skills can be done very much in short, sharp packages, where COVID-19 and the challenges that have faced us and how the university has responded with a lot more online training, those opportunities are going to become much easier for us to capitalise on now. So you might do, you know, a 1-month-long course in presentation skills, and then you might do your MBA by coursework and online over 5 years. You know, these sorts of things are all worth doing, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're not out in the marketplace making a living.
Rich, my view on this topic of the elevator test, the primary beneficiaries of that test is the person making the pitch and the elevator company. Because I struggle to think of a situation where you could appropriately understand that audience and engage in a way that motivates them. The point that Greg has made has been well made. And I agree with that it does a lot of good for the presenter to reflect on the way that they're seeing their offerings and put it in such a way that makes it presentable. But I would put all of that on pause and focus on understanding, not pitching per se, but understanding. So if, for example, you hopped into the lift with somebody who you understood and you've had engagements with, that pitch test makes a lot of sense. So you've got 3 winners there prospectively. But in the absence of that, you only have 2.
Good point. Yeah, just change tack a little bit. Paula asked, is there a difference in how industry in Australia approaches researchers as opposed to researchers approaching industry compared to, say, other countries? You know, is it us pitching to industry more in Australia, and in the US, for example, industry is approaching universities to partner? Do you see a big difference?
So I might have a go at that to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
So I've now worked in Australia and in regional Australia, in the US, and Sweden, in Japan, and in India. And each of those are different in this regard. And each of those countries has a different perspective on how important science and technology has been to their development as a country, right? Or as a nation. And so you're working with that to some extent. So when one of my colleagues was trying to do some benchmarking studies around technology transfer compared to the University of Melbourne. One of the places they went was Columbia University in New York City. And the question was asked, you know, how long do some of your packages of intellectual property, meaning generated by the academics, sit on the shelf? And the technology transfer professional just looked dumbfounded and went, our technology never sits on the shelf. Every piece of technology we generate is sold 5 times over. We always have a challenge for, you know, what's the right price for this technology. So the context of that then is New York City, entrepreneurial community, everybody willing to take a risk, lots of investors approaching lots of academics, probably lots of academics who've come from families that are used to doing business like that. And so you've got the community thing. So we can't necessarily just transplant that back to Australia, but we can, I think, build it by encouraging more scientists to be in areas of investment banking, in public policy, in civil society. So scientists don't just work in science institutions, they're out there. And our students are doing that, which is fantastic, right? That's the first thing. But also having our scientists who are career scientists, recognizing that they have part of their life, it will be engagement with the broader community. So there's a richer conversation so that people understand, you know, how often Australian technology has been really successful internationally and how we do hit above our weight. Those sort of comments, you hear them on occasion in the press, but they're kind of hollow unless somebody says, you know, I know somebody who translated a particular bit of technology and it was incredibly successful. So the community has to be more broadly aware of it. I'll add one extra comment. I mean, we are in a community that I don't think necessarily understands the full benefit of academic achievement, full stop, whether it be commercial or translational or whatever. And I remember I was lucky enough to go to a graduation ceremony in Uppsala in Sweden. And the Swedes have a day, they have a public holiday that is around higher education. Everybody celebrates higher degrees for one whole day. Imagine. I don't think we're anywhere near that.
No, really. Davi,
I agree with, I think Greg nailed it in terms of that fluidity of the community. But I would say to you that even though we don't in Australia have those frames of reference and the context and the infrastructure that just naturally facilitates that, individual researchers and teams of researchers can do just that. They won't necessarily have the infrastructure that they can just fall on top of, but if they design and execute well, they can replicate those kinds of activities. It's not the case that if you are in Australia, those things are closed off from you. It means that if you're in Australia, you just won't be naturally encouraged, or those opportunities won't naturally be presented to you. The best of the best in Australia will succeed, in spite of those limitations.
Yeah, it leads on to Vern's question here about, you know, do we have the right incentive mechanism in place? Because, yeah, is it that academics are disinclined to take up commercialization research because they get rewarded for peer-reviewed papers? So it's not vital for academic progression. What can we do to change that situation? Is there anything in the wings to change that situation?
I might start there.
Sure.
And let me just firstly pay respect to my colleague, Vern. I could have easily started with a photograph early in my talk of me standing beside Vern. I would have told exactly the same story. You know, Vern has done marvellous, applied marvellous efforts to take some good intellectual property out to market and deserves our celebration because of it. Let me say that I think it's absolutely correct to say that we do not have academic incentives or career progression mechanisms correct. I am aware that the university is currently running a program looking at progression structures, and somebody alerted me to the whole list of things that are part of the promotion, what would you say, promotion criteria for level C, D and E. And there's very little that I could see in there that looked like incentives for commercialisation or engagement activity. Having said that, two of our colleagues, Rachel Carey and Ruth Nettle and her team, were recognised for industry engaged research last year through awards. That's a very positive thing. It's suggesting that the broader community is seeing the importance of engagement and impact. So I think we're getting there gradually. I think we've got a long way to go. And, you can't imagine a circumstance yet where somebody could freely move from industry back into academe and backwards and forwards and have equal status in each place. And it just kind of doesn't work. And you look at my own career and you can see that's exactly the story.
I think it's worth noting, Rich, that in the current environment, that transition is being strongly encouraged. Researchers within institutions are indirectly being encouraged to be directing at least part of their attention to the upside opportunities that industries wanting to identify and realise, as well as, if not more importantly, manage that downside risk that I referred to in the presentation.
Now, we can't go through one of these without a COVID-19 question. I think that stands for itself. So thank you, Paola. COVID-19 has underpinned the importance of science and preparedness, as well as inequalities in the world. Do you think post-pandemic will have an impact on opportunities for industry engagement and how we engage with stakeholders?
You want to start this one, Davi?
Go ahead.
Up to you.
I think it's already happening, Rich. I think it's a great question. I think COVID-19 has really elevated, in terms of my discussions in industry, the importance of gaining access to that science. And because I work a lot in that nexus between agriculture and the environment, I'm seeing that theme over and over and over again in terms of anticipating much better the real possibilities of these breakout risks. It was kind of nice to be talking about previously. It's much higher up on the agenda now. And so that research contribution is seen to be a more significant part of the conversation, as opposed to thinking back even last year. It was a nice discussion to be having, but now it's almost as though it's an essential discussion to be having. And I think it will translate into the way that research is being perceived, and researchers are being drawn in to the conversation to influence those activities. Greg?
Yeah, thanks, Davi. This is a great question. Thanks, Paolo. I know there's a lot in there. I can't unpack it all, but let me just tell you that we sitting here in the University of Melbourne are in a very strong position because the Doherty Institute has been such a high impact, high profile institution in the way Australia responds to COVID-19. Lots of people have seen it. And our colleague, Martin Elhay, has been in the thick of this. Basically, lots of companies, lots of philanthropists calling up and saying, how can I help? Now, there's a big wash that comes from that. And it's a positive wash across us all that we're in the same institute. So there are any number of philanthropists approaching the advancement groups of the university at the minute, saying, we would like to see what you guys are doing. If you're doing such a great job with COVID-19, maybe your teams can do something to help me with this particular job. So I think that is a very positive thing. So I think just picking up a little bit on Rich Eckard's comment earlier about the elevator pitch, I'm of the view that you always have in the top drawer of your desk your 3 best ideas. From now to the rest of your career, your best ideas are in the top drawer, right? And when an opportunity for funding comes, you are ready within hours to pitch it. And because any number of times in my career in different environments, people have walked in and said, there's $2 million on the table. Do you have an idea that could, use this $2 million? So right at the moment, there is COVID-19 specific research going on, but there's a lot of correlates of that. And Rich, if you let me just have another minute, I'm sorry, I won't go on too long, but what is happening is that individuals, I said philanthropists, I said companies, but it's also government. Government is saying, yes, we know the universities are really struggling, but we need the universities to help us find our way to economic development in this next, let's say 5 years. This is a critical time. So the very specific question government is asking us is, what can you do for regional development in Australia? And this is where all of us should have our best ideas in the top drawer and just deal with the fact that, it's a 1 in 10 chance that those ideas will get up, but 1 in 10 is bloody good. That's a good chance.
The example is the Chief Scientist Technology Roadmap, the process we've been engaged in. We've even seen an increase in the demand for climate change action and research coming out of COVID-19 as, it's exposed cracks in the coal industry and vulnerabilities there because no one wants energy right now, and the industry needs a certain level of income. So actually, it's even stimulated demand for renewable energy in a strange way. Final question, more about students and industry. Is it worth the university to bring graduate students, postgraduate students into these industry relationships so they get some early guidance in their career of industry interaction?
You go, Davi.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, but it shouldn't be just a one-way street. It needs to be thought of as a two-way street. And that is, what kind of enriching experience can industry provide those students to guide their research, whilst at the same time, to what extent can researchers and those around them contribute to the way that industry is thinking about industry's interests? So there are programs in place to facilitate those experiential activities. But I really do think it needs to go beyond the base level of providing a student with some simple experience. I think we should be striving as an institution to enrich that experience, enrich the interactions, even at that level, because those people, and again, the people around them, have a lot to offer and will work collaboratively, all else being equal, but to lead to those things that we've been talking about today. So I do think those experiential programs have a lot of merit, but it's not just about giving students some experience. It's about grounding the conversation, or grounding the relationship rather, in a way that can be sustainable. And you build on that. And that's where the magic happens. Greg?
Right.
Great response, Davi. Can't add much to that other than to alert everybody to a series of mentoring programs that are now developing around the country. And one of them in particular, from the Australian Academy of Sciences, is the IMNIS, which is Industry Mentoring Network in STEM. STEM being science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Now, in this circumstance, people from industry are providing their knowledge as mentors, particularly for PhD students. Students who are in the middle of their PhDs get an opportunity to look at what the future might be. Now, that is very much a two-way street. That is very much the students getting some enrichment and seeing some future options that they maybe hadn't considered beyond academia. But it's the other way around as well. It's the senior members of industry getting refreshed and enhanced by, you know, the enthusiasm of young researchers. So it's a, please look at IMNIS. It's a great thing, and the University of Melbourne's active in the program.
So that is again the acronym again.
IMNIS. IMNIS.
Great, excellent. Well, I think we've run close to time, and I think it's been excellent to hear from both you, Greg and Davi. Thank you very much for your time today. I think we've learned we've got to have those ideas in our top drawer ready to go. We've learned more about that partnership with industry and how we should be engaging. So I think there's been a lot of value out of this about how we in the future engage more with industry. So thank you very much for your time. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks so much, Rich.
Thank you. As you exit the webinar, attendees, you'll get a survey of questions. This is about improving these types of forums in the future. So please take time to fill in the webinar. And thanks finally to Greg and Davi for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you. Cheers.